Welcome to Tape, powered by the Ram 1500 Sport, built exclusively for Canadians. I'm 2020 Ryan Dixon. He's 2020 Rory Boylan. Rory, we released our favorite moments of the decade earlier in this year, but this is our first time being back in the studio together in this new year. Are you fired up?
Oh yeah, I'm fired up. I'm ready for the stretch drive to the All-Star game, then to the trade deadline, and then that last little stretch to the playoffs. I mean, there's so many things that could happen here, right? Like, you've got teams that are figuring it out after slow starts, teams that were maybe playing a little bit above their heads that are slowing down, and we're trying to figure out, like, who's going to buy, how aggressive are they going to buy, who's going to sell. Is another coach going to get fired? Is a GM going to get fired before long here? Like, there's a lot of movement still to play out here, and it's gonna come quickly. Right now, the playoffs are still a couple months away, but they're going to arrive just like that, I think.
They are, and there's a decent chance right now that the Nashville Predators won't be in them. Can Nashville turn it around under new coach John Hines? That's what we're going to ask Adam Vingan when he comes on later on in the show. But right now, you and I are going to jump into some 30,000-foot view over this big, great nation of ours at the halfway point of the NHL season. Want to check in with the Canadian teams. Now, all of them have actually, the odometer's gone past 41 games. Things have changed a bit since before Christmas, precipitously for some teams. Yep. The Leafs up, the Canadiens down.
Yep.
The Oilers kind of stable. Edmonton, Calgary.
I don't think Oilers and stable.
All right. Well, I was going to say at least Oilers, Vancouver, Calgary.
Yes. I get
still
what you're
sniffing around a spot. Ottawa, kind of its own separate conversation at this point, I would say. I mean, we probably set them aside, but I guess really the news of the second quarter from a Canadian perspective, it would have to be the Loopy Leafs shooting up the standings with their Sheldon Keefe cheat code.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this when we went on Good Show in December, I think it was, and you know, my view of it then, it was everything that could have gone wrong went wrong basically for the Leafs. Like, you had a long stretch without John Tavares in the lineup to injury, a long stretch without Mitch Marner in the lineup due to injury, a coach at the end of his line, a backup goalie, any backup goalie that you put in there wasn't playing anything close to NHL caliber. And it was just seemed like this couldn't keep going that way. And it struck me as this is the worst the Leafs are going to have, the worst stretch the Leafs are going to have all year. They can only get better for them. And Sheldon Keefe comes in and, you know, lo and behold, he plays a team that's designed to play a certain way to its strengths, and it seems to be working out just fine. The more solid you get into the playoffs, the more you can take the foot off the gas of Frederik Andersen's workload, and he can be rested a little bit more for the playoffs, but you still have some games to win before you get into that area. It just seems like everything's kind of coming together finally, and you're over some major injuries. Maybe some more happen down the stretch, but the fact is the worst things that all happened in a 2-month stretch have seemed to have passed, and this team is now hitting the stride that it should have hit earlier in the season. The worst is past them. These are the Leafs that we expected and can expect going forward. And there's no way that they missed the playoffs. Again, we're looking at this division, and it's like they're either going to play Tampa Bay or Boston again in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I think anything else would be a bit of a surprise.
So let me flip to the West because, as I said, Ottawa, you know, I feel like that's a bit of a different conversation. And I mean, just in general, things from a certain perspective are going well there.
Yeah.
And very much the opposite for Montreal. So we'll save them. Winnipeg, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton.
Yeah.
How many of those four do you think end up in the playoffs?
Oh, man.
They're all right there or just
right there.
in?
I'm going to go with, I'm going to go with two of them.
Two?
Yeah. And I'm starting to lose faith in the Winnipeg Jets because
Connor Hellebuyck is overworked.
Connor Hellebuck's finally, it's coming back to earth a little bit. And again, remember, I was down on this guy at the start of the season because his high danger save percentage historically has been awful. And Winnipeg with a just depleted blue line was going to give up a lot more of those. And what ended up happening was they did give up a lot on this. They gave up the second most in the league to only Chicago Blackhawks. And Hellebuck's high danger save percentage actually was one of the best in the league for the first few months of the season, but it's starting to come back. It's starting to come back to reality a little bit. And if that's going to stay that way, that's big trouble for Winnipeg. Even if you get Dustin Byfuglien back, reasonably, how long can we expect it's going to take him to get to
How
be
many
Dustin
high danger
Byfuglien?
scoring chances is he shutting down?
Yeah, and then what is he going to really create the other way? Like, he's been off for a long time and dealing with an injury, so it's not going to be an instant thing. He's back in the lineup, and he's Dustin Byfuglien. I'm not convinced that this is a team that Kevin Cheveldayoff is going to throw another first rounder out at the trade market for to upgrade on. His history as a GM has been one to be quiet at the deadline, right? And just these last 2 years, Winnipeg was active. A team that looked like they should win a cup or could compete, so he went out and did it. This team isn't that, and the Central is a really tough division. I'm looking at the Pacific, and I think two of those teams can get in. And I thought Calgary was a pretty good lock to get there. I still feel pretty good about them, but they've been kind of hit and miss. They've been on a winning streak here lately, though. It really comes down to what is Edmonton and Vancouver going to do at the trade deadline. I think Edmonton especially, I would be surprised if they don't do anything. I don't think they go big game hunting necessarily, but does Ken Holland make that first round pick available? I mean, maybe at least the second and the third. Maybe you make a Samorukov available because you have a strength on the blue line. So maybe that's where you can give up a bit on the prospect end, just to add some kind of secondary scoring. A guy for the second line, or even a winger for the first line, so that you can keep moving forward, having McDavid and Draisaitl split up, which is what you really need to do to get this team forward. And then Vancouver, I don't know if they're as much of a sure thing to do something at the deadline. They're a bit more capped out. They have a bit more of a long-term view, I think, than Edmonton. But I see two of those teams getting in, and it might just be really who hits a hot streak in March.
Sure. Does Markstrom get on another
Does
great
Markstrom
run
go on
for
another tear?
Vancouver?
And you could certainly see that happening. Does Elias Pettersson just kind of take over,
Sure.
But at the same time, like that's a team, especially on its blue line, that has been hit by injuries a lot over the years. And if that happens at the wrong time, I mean, that could end their playoff hopes too, right? It would be tough for all three of those teams to get in, I think, with Arizona and Vegas. Pretty surefire teams to get into the playoffs, I think. And then the tough Central taking up some wild cards. I think two of them could get in, though.
So that leaves the Canadiens, who are very quickly moving toward the part of potential seller. They could be on their second 8-game losing streak of the season by the time people hear this. Who knows? Maybe they'll win Thursday night against the Oilers. There's two names that crop up when people talk about selling. Jeff Petrie and Thomas Tatar, both of whom are under contract for next year. And to me, if the expectation was this team should be competing for the playoffs this year, then it must be that they're going to be trying to compete for the playoffs next year. So are you really going to send those guys away for second-round picks or even a first-round pick? I'm not sure. I mean, a first-rounder, sure, but
for Tatar, I would consider that.
That's what I would say. That Petrie, in my mind, if you are moving toward a spot where you really want to push in as opposed to still really building and retooling, I don't know how you get rid of Jeff Petrie for next year's team.
He's found money. You got him for nothing, right?
Got him for a second rounder at the deadline 5 years ago.
From a team that needs defense.
Tartar's found money, and that's why I feel like if you just let him go after he has a great 3-year run in Montreal, then he was a throw-in to the Pacioretty deal.
Yeah, I feel that Tatar his loss would be more easily filled in by what you have in the system.
Right.
So I think that's where you could explore getting a first-round pick, because build out your prospect base is never a bad thing to keep doing that. But Petrie is a guy, I mean, he is legitimately a top-pair defenseman on a pretty good contract by AAV.
Yeah.
So, again, like to your point, this isn't a team that is giving up on next season. They're wanting to make the playoffs next season, and if you give up a Jeff Petrie, that's not something that you're easily going to fill in on your prospects or through free agency. That's a guy you need to keep moving forward with. So unless it is an offer that just you look at it and say, what was this other team thinking offering this? You've got to keep Petrie. I think you're probably going to keep Tatar too, but he's one I would be more likely to explore trading.
They're a real case study in, your feelings for them are relative to what lens you want to look at. If you look at them as a team that should have been in the playoffs this year, then yeah, it's a failure. But if you look at it as a team that's kind of done a reset here in the past couple of years, that's worked Nick Suzuki into the lineup, Cale Fleury into the lineup.
Well,
of course it'd be great to make the playoffs, but they probably weren't going anywhere anyway. You'd kind of wonder if getting your Lafreniere odds up in a year where the draft is in Montreal, at the very least, even drafting 6th overall or something is maybe still a better path for this team that, like all teams, should be thinking, we don't want to get the playoffs. We want to be able to win the Stanley Cup at some point.
Yeah, and I touched on this in the NHL newsletter today a bit. This is the dynamic I'm interested in Montreal, and the real question is, in terms of Marc Bergevin and Claude Julien, who's safe and who's on the hot seat? Because Bergevin, this is his 8th season as GM, and we could be looking at him missing the playoffs 3 years in a row and for 4 of the last 5, which is, that's not, you look at that and you say, how does a GM keep his job in that situation? But he's found a couple of players for nothing who have become impact players. He's built the prospect base, a center depth that was not there just a couple of years ago. Suddenly you have
overflowing.
Yeah,
now.
Exactly. So he's actually done a very, very good job, you could say. And now you have to look at it, where is this going to go in the next couple of years? And is he the guy to keep guiding that? And I think there's a lot of reason to believe that he is. Claude Julien, though, I mean, he's under contract, I think, for another 2 years after this one. So it would be an expensive firing. Not that the Habs couldn't, absorb that or whatever. But, the only season that he would have reached the playoffs with this team was when he first joined it in February, more than halfway through. So over a full season, he still hasn't guided this team to the playoffs. Does that mean he should be on the hot seat?
I think they're both back.
I kind of think it has to be.
Yeah,
you have to consider it, don't you?
You have to consider it. But
2 8-game losing streaks potentially in one season.
You know what? I think he's back unless it becomes a situation where it's gruesome and something's got to happen. I think the way the team plays, the chances they create at 5-on-5 reflect well on the coach. If I had to lay a nickel, I'd say they're both back next year. I want to ask you about a couple other things before we wrap up the first segment about the second half. Last year, we saw St. Louis and Carolina just take off in the second half. Yeah. Do you think there's any candidates like that for a big rise this year? Because I don't.
No, it's funny you asked that. We were looking at that question for our Sunday piece that we do, the 3 big questions. And one of them was, okay, who is this year's St. Louis? And we're all looking at it like, I don't know, San Jose, because they have players, but they don't have goaltending.
It might be Nashville. We can ask Adam later because they need to just change one position, it seems like, but that's going to be tough.
The tricky thing with doing it is you couldn't have even predicted that really for St. Louis confidently last year.
Yeah.
Like you could say there are pieces here and maybe they get going, but to go on the run they did and win the Stanley Cup, you wouldn't have looked at them in January and said, this is the team that's going to do that for sure. So maybe there is a team. It doesn't. Any team that you might pick has a lot of problems with it, a lot of underlying problems, and it just doesn't seem like there is one. I mean, even what St. Louis did last year, I mean, that doesn't happen very often.
That's right.
So
really don't see it.
It's really hard to expect someone to do that. The question is there somebody that's out of the playoffs probably by 3 or more points that could get into the playoffs? Even that is a stretch, I think, at this point, because there are so many teams that are really tightly packed.
This segment brought to you by Subway. Subway now delivers, no joke. Joining us from Chicago, he covers the Nashville Predators for The Athletic. It's Adam Vingan. Adam, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
We are good. We want to know a lot of things about Nashville, but let's start with the coaching change. Did you see this coming, and what might life under John Hynes bring with Peter Laviolette out of the scene now?
Well, I didn't see it coming based on David Poile's history. David Poile, an incredibly patient, perhaps to a fault, general manager. Of course, John Hynes is the 3rd head coach in the Predators' history. Barry Trotz, then Peter Laviolette, now John Hynes. but he's also the 6th head coach in 37 years that David Poile has had as an NHL general manager, when you include the Washington Capitals, where he had both Murrays, Brian and Terry, and then I believe Jim Schoenfeld. So 6 head coaches in 37 years as a GM. So it was sort of a battle within between my gut and my brain, where my gut told me something seems off here, while my brain was like, but David never does this, so perhaps pump the brakes, gut. But I got the sense after the Winter Classic, again, it was just, I guess you can call it my spidey sense, right? Mm-hmm. That we have as journalists sometimes, where I just felt like the way they lost that game, I just felt like it may not be one they're able to come back from. He did coach the next 2 games, and they got 3 out of 4 points. But just something about the way they performed on that stage, the biggest stage in regular season history, because of course they played in the Stanley Cup final, but in front of 85,000 plus people, 20,000 plus estimated came from Nashville to Dallas for that game. And for them to lose the way they did, which really was a typical Predators game for most of the season. If you had never watched the Predators up until the Winter Classic and you wanted to know what their season was like in one game, the Winter Classic was almost a perfect example. It just felt like for this team to get back on track, it wasn't going to work with Peter. This is really going to be, I'm in Chicago, as I mentioned, they play the Blackhawks tonight. This is really going to be John Hines' debut. He was behind the bench on Tuesday when they lost to Boston, but his holdover assistants, Dan Lambert and Dan Muse, were basically running the game. He was doing a lot of observing. So this will really be my first opportunity to see the John Hines coached Nashville Predators. So in terms of what he's expecting, how the team might change, I'm still trying to gather that, and tonight will be a good indicator of what we might see going forward.
What has been going on with this team? We know Roman Josi leads the team in scoring, has been fantastic. We know Nashville is a team with a strong defense core. They brought in Matt Duchene to try and bolster the forward group. But what have you seen from the skaters on the plus and negative side through half a season?
Well, I think when I was writing the story about the coaching change, I was doing some research, and these numbers are not updated, but this was just at the time of the coaching change. So this was as of Monday night. As of Monday night before play, the Predators were 6th in the league in goals per game. If you look at the percentage of points scored by forwards this season at that time, they were 30th in the league. Of course, Roman Josi having the season that he is having skews those numbers, but a lot more was expected offensively of a lot of the forwards on this team. So for them to be near the bottom of the league in terms of how many points they're putting on the board, that really stood out to me. Their leading scorers at the time, a few days ago among forwards, were Philip Forsberg and Matt Duchene, who were tied at 28 points each. If you sorted all of the forwards in the league by points, they were tied for 89th. So their leading forward scorers were barely in the top 100 of forward scoring in the NHL. So they haven't been getting enough from their forwards in terms of offensive production. And in the past, that was to be expected because the Predators were traditionally weak at forward and strong on defense. Then they got stronger at forward when he was coach. So this group of forwards with Ryan Johansson and Matt Duchene, Philip Forsberg, Victor Arvidsson, Mikhail Granlund, Craig Smith, the list goes on, certainly the most talented group of forwards they've ever had, but they weren't scoring enough. So that really stood out to me, and I'm curious as to what John Hines will do, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, what he'll do to try to get more out of those forwards.
Well, let me ask about the crease because I feel like it's unavoidable here. Second worst team save percentage in the league. Pekka Rinne, an icon there, but 37 years old. Saros, I think there was some notion that, the past couple years even, that he might be able to nudge his countrymen aside, but clearly hasn't taken the opportunity to assert himself. What prospects are there for better goaltending, whether it's from guys currently with the team, or is there any chance David Poile could look outside the organization to try and address what seems like the most glaring issue on the team?
Well, it certainly stands out because of how historically strong goaltending has been in Nashville. And Pekka Rinne got off to a fabulous start this season. I believe he started 8-0-2, but since then, he's among the worst starting goaltenders in the NHL. And as a tandem, UC Saros and Pekka Rinne are among the worst tandems in the NHL for a variety of reasons. You mentioned the overall team save percentage. If you get a bit fancier, they're also near the bottom of the league in goals saved above average and goals saved above expectation. UC Saros has struggled more, in my opinion, than Pekka Rinne this year, and things have sort of turned into a timeshare. I think over the past month and a half, their starts are basically even or very close to it. And I asked John Hines about that today, actually, if he will continue to do that. And he said that in today's NHL, you can't ride one goaltender. So expect Pekka Rinne and UC Saros to continue, to basically share the net.
Do you have a sense for what buttons John Hines might be able to push on some of the big-time forwards?
Well, I think it starts with how they'll be used in the offensive zone. And John Hines mentioned at his introductory press conference the saying, we fight for middle ice. So yesterday I asked him what that meant, and I have the quote in front of me. So I'll read it. He said, for example, like off the line rush, we want to make sure that we have a hard penetrating player coming in between the two opposing defensemen driving to the net. We want to make sure in the offensive zone that we have players that get inside the dots around the net front in the high slot area where it's dangerous to be able to play. When you own the middle of the ice, your percentages go up to score, which is basically Hockey 101, but the Predators have had a hard time getting to those areas. And I'm curious if players like Matt Duchene, who we know is not afraid to shoot the puck, and Ryan Johansson, who seems to have an aversion to shooting the puck, I wonder if that will help them as well as a player like Philip Forsberg or Victor Arvidsson or Kyle Turris, having a different mentality in terms of how they attack. And I'm curious to see if that helps because, the Predators' best forward line this year in terms of actual production has been Rocco Grimaldi, Nick Bonino, and Craig Smith. And that should be a luxury. That should be your quote unquote third line that's backing up your top two lines. That should not be your most productive line. So I'm very curious to see how that works. I'm curious to see some of the more, some of the other intricacies of John Hines' coaching style in terms of how he deploys certain players, penalty killing pairs, power play units. We'll get a better sense of that starting tonight. But, I really do think that he needs to implement a system that gets more out of his forwards from those high danger areas because they've had a hard time getting there.